And I want to welcome, good morning again, my name is Dr. Shaniel Ely. I'm the Associate Vice President of Outreach and Community Engagement, and so we want to welcome those of you who haven't been with us all week to campus and to McCass and Marohn. So today we have a Curbside Chat and a Keynote session with Charles Marohn of Strong Towns. Want to give a special welcome again to those who have joined us from the community. I've already had someone ask, what are these name badges? Why did I get a name badge? You guys are welcome to be here. Those who have name badges are with us with the Community Development Institute, and it's a week-long program. Those who aren't part this year, we invite you to come and join us next year for a week-long program of community development. This special keynote session is sponsored by AT&T and the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. I want to, at this time, recognize Melinda Fauble. Are you here, Melinda? Okay. She is from AT&T and is a board member of CDI and a longtime supporter of CDI. So we thank her and AT&T for their support. I also want to recognize other board members who are here in the room today. Could you stand? CDI Advisory Board. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you guys for being here this morning. At this time, I would like to introduce Daniel Davis, who is the Assistant VP and Community Affairs Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank, and he will introduce our keynote speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ely, and thank you, UCA, for being such a great host for this gathering today. Looking out on this room, I don't know about you, but it's exciting, like to see this many folks gathered together talking about the things that you're talking about over these several days. You know, my father was a Southern Baptist minister, and my father used to stand before his congregation, and he used to hold one hand up, and he'd say, keep doing what you're doing, and then he'd hold the other hand up, and he'd say, keep getting what you're getting. And he would say that to folks to say, if you like the results you're getting in your life, then just keep doing what you're doing. But if you don't like the results you're getting, then it's maybe time to change paths. And I just want to look at UCA folks today, and I want to say, keep doing what you're doing, keep getting what you're getting, because year after year, you are a leader in bringing together community development professionals across Arkansas and the Mid-South, and in leading really a movement of folks who are taking control of their own communities. And so thank you for all the work that you're doing. I have the distinguished honor this morning of introducing our keynote speaker. Charles Marohn, known as Chuck to his friends and colleagues, is a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He is founder and president of Strong Towns. I don't know if you've had time to check out Strong Towns. Hopefully you're familiar with it by now. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota's Institute of Technology and a master of urban and regional planning degree from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute. He's the lead author of Thoughts on Building Strong Towns, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3, as well as the author of a world-class transportation system. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast. I don't know if you've listened to the Strong Towns podcast. If you haven't, let me whet your appetite. Recent titles of podcast sessions include, Why is it so hard to get things built? Something we all could use some good learning on. How about this one? What does it mean to build a vibrant community? Or this one, From Vision to Policy, Making New Urbanism Work. He's also the primary writer for Strong Towns web content, and he's presented Strong Town concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America, including now Conway, Arkansas. And in 2017, he was named one of the most influential urbanists of all time. He's a longtime commentator on KAXE's Northern Community Radio, and he currently hosts the Dig Deep program, a monthly examination of public policy issues affecting Minnesotans. Will you join me in welcoming Chuck Marohn?
Thank you. Very, very nice to be here today. I've been told how wonderful the weather is. Being from Minnesota, I got here yesterday and I thought, oh, it's really hot here. So nice. It was 47 degrees this morning back home, which is a really nice sleeping weather, right? I am going to talk a little bit today about why our cities struggle financially. Many, many years ago, working as an engineer, working as a planner, I would encounter situations where cities, despite having lots of growth, despite having lots of investment, despite doing all the things that we think create success, would have these perpetual budget shortfalls. Why can we find the money to build million-dollar shortcuts around the south side of town like my city did, but we can't find the money to keep the streetlights on? We can't find money to fix the sidewalks. We can't keep the library open past 4 o'clock on a weekday. Why can we find the money, as we talked about a little bit last night for those of you that were there, to run sewer and water out to the far edges of town to try to create economic development and growth, but we can't find the money to keep our police officers and our firefighters employed? What we're going to talk about today are some of the systematic things that are happening that are really bankrupting our cities, and then talk about new ways to think about growth and development that can make us stronger, healthier, and more prosperous. I want to start with our mission for Strong Towns. We are a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. I'm going to give you our website again here at the end. Welcome you to take part in our conversation. We're publishing 3-4 articles a day. We do a couple podcasts a week. We do a lot of videos. The stuff we're doing is to try to change the cultural conversation we're having in this country around growth and development. And you are welcome to be part of that conversation and part of that movement for change. I want you to think about the way we built cities thousands of years ago. These are two artist renderings. The one on the left is an ancient city called Fertile Crescent, like 4000 BC. The one on the right, of course, is ancient Rome. If you look at these ancient civilizations, we all understand that they were built around the dominant transportation technology of the day, that, of course, being your 2 feet. People would walk everywhere they go, so the spacing, the scale, the distances between different things you would do on a normal day, all this was based around a society of people who walked. Fast forward thousands of years, this is my hometown. I live in a little town of Brainerd, Minnesota, a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is what it looked like back in the early 1900s. People would arrive by stagecoach, they'd arrive by train, but once they got here, they would walk to everything that they went to. And so the scale, the spacing, the distances between different types of things you would do on a normal day, all this was based around a society of people who walked. Beginning in the early 1900s and then accelerating after World War II, we began to build society around a different transportation technology. We began to build society around an automobile, right? We came up with different building types, different building styles, different ways of arranging things on the landscape. If we were to go out today and ask people to explain this transition, they would most likely talk about it in terms of progress. We used to walk everywhere, so we built cities around people who walked. Now we drive everywhere, so we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities completely differently than we do now. And someday we will have teleportation technology, and our cities will be unrecognizable to us. This is a very comforting and affirming way to think about this transition. It puts us on this continuum of progress, things always getting better. There's another way to look at this, however, that isn't quite as comforting. And I want to put this idea in the back of your minds today as we embark on this conversation together. When we look at these ancient civilizations, what we have to acknowledge is that by the time you get to even ancient humans have been experimenting with how to build places for thousands of years. They tried things. What worked, they would keep and expand upon. What didn't work, those places often failed. Those people died. They went away. The idea behind, the concepts behind how to build places like this were developed over thousands and thousands of years by trial and error experimentation. How do we orient the streets? How do we place the buildings? How do we interact with different things. By the time you get to ancient Rome, you have a style of building that had been honed and refined by trial and error over a long, long period of time. And by the time you get to my hometown in the early 1900s, you basically have a pattern of development that is universal. We can go to different cultures, different societies around the world in different latitudes, different continents, and what we see is a layout and a design that is very, very similar. When we look at this style of development, even though for us, this is all we've ever known, right? This is very familiar to us. When I was a young engineer and I would ask questions of people I was working with, they would say, well, come on, Chuck, this is the way it's always been done. But of course, this isn't the way it's always been done, right? These are very new ideas. These ideas didn't come about through thousands of years of trial and error experimentation. We didn't take these ideas and go to Missouri and say, we're going to try it here for a couple hundred years, and then we'll take the best of what worked there and bring it here to Arkansas, right? What did we do? We just did this everywhere. We transformed an entire continent within a generation around a new set of ideas. Transformed not only how we live, but how we work, how we interact with each other, how we, how we meet, how we fall in love, how we make decisions, how we start businesses. We changed everything about our living arrangement in the blink of an eye. What I want you to understand and to appreciate is how huge of an experiment this is. How we have embarked on something that not only nobody has ever done, but nobody even dreamed of doing. We are in a brand new place. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the financial ramifications of this shift. When I first started, there was a dimming of the lights, and I actually think that might help a little bit if we could do that. Just so you could see, because some of these slides are a little bit resolution. So one of the things that I did early on at Strong Towns, one of the things that we did is we went out and we started to look at developments and ask a different set of questions. A lot of times when we did projects as an engineer, as planners, what we see is that the project we're working on doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's this kind of underlying notion that when you add all these things up into a big whole, a big economy, that makes sense. And I started to doubt that kind of internal theory, that backstory of the American development pattern. And what I said is that there's got to be parts of the system where we can measure that would stand on their own, and then be able to infer from that things that are happening in the parts of the system where things are more complicated. Not to go too deep into details, but when I first started to do this, I would do an analysis of an area, and then you'd look and say, well, the pipe cost extra because it's extra deep, so it could serve areas over there. The road is widened out because there's all these complexities. So we said, where can we find places without a lot of complexity, without all the background noise? Start with a development like this. This is a dead-end cul-de-sac, just a simple residential development. No through traffic, no commercial traffic. The only reason this road exists is to serve these homes. When this was built, the city came in and said, we would like this road paved. We will pay half the cost if you, the property owners, will pay the other half. We looked at the tax revenue the city was collecting from the people that live there and said, okay, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the half the cost that they spent to build the road? The answer is 37 years. Now, the road's not going to last 37 years. The city's on the hook to maintain it. At some point, they're going to have to come up with that money. It's not going to be coming from these property owners here. Here's another development. This one a little bit bigger in size, but again, a closed loop system with a dead-end cul-de-sac up here. No through traffic, no commercial traffic, no potential for future expansion of any sort. This road just serves the people that are there. When this one was built, the developer came in and put in all the infrastructure, paid for that. Of course, those costs were rolled over into the sale price of the homes. People have been paying that value in their mortgages. At the same time, they've been paying taxes to the city to go out and maintain this stuff. The road had completely fallen apart. The city went out and fixed it. The cost to do that was $354,000. We asked the question, Based on the tax revenue the city collects from the people within this development, the only people who really use this road in any meaningful way, how long is it going to take the city to recoup what they just spent? The answer is 79 years. We then said, okay, well, let's say the city wanted to try to collect enough money from these property owners here to actually maintain their road, and they wanted to do that between now and the time the road was projected to fall apart again. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the water, the storm sewer, vastly more expensive undertakings. Now, sometimes people say to me, okay, Chuck, we get it. We know we lose money on residential property. We make it up on commercial. Commercial is our cash cow. This is a business park, one of those build it and they will come kind of investments that cities like to do. It's got the wide industrial streets, the very deep pipe, set up for growth and expansion. This was built, and after a couple decades, every single lot was now filled out, was built upon. And the city felt this was such a successful project that they wanted to build the exact same thing on property they owned right next door. They wanted to take this and repeat it right over here. We asked the question, okay, if we could build the same thing for the same amount of money and get the same exact return, how would that work out for us? In today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, it would be $2.1 million. There's $6.6 million of tax base out in this park. Now pause for a second, because in this current park, 4 of the lots belong to a church, 2 belong to the school district. It's a bus maintenance building. One of them belongs to the county, a maintenance garage, and the city also has a maintenance garage out here. None of those properties pay any taxes, right? Of the remaining properties in the existing park, every single one of them was given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to move into this park. We ran the numbers every way we could. The only way we could make it cash flow was if we assumed that within 12 months of the new park being built, every single lot would be developed by a full tax-paying, non-subsidized entity, and that every single penny of new revenue would go towards paying off that debt. If that were to occur, it would still take the city almost 3 decades, 29 years, to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would have to go up to pay to sweep the streets, mow the ditches, provide police protection, fire protection, and all the services that are required. And that's in the most wildly optimistic scenario. I used to go through and do 15 of these, 20 of these, because I was very proud of our work. At a certain point, people get it. People start to cry. If you like these case studies, there's a whole bunch of them on our website, and I encourage you to go there. I'm going to kind of get to the crux of what's going on, because once you see it, it becomes very obvious, actually too obvious to ignore any longer. You will all have trouble now going around in your communities looking at things because you're going to look at them differently. Let's say that we have a developer that comes to town. The developer comes to us and says, I have a piece of property I would like to build upon. I will, at my expense, build all the commercial buildings. I'll build all the residential buildings. I'm not asking for any variances from your rules. I'll follow all your rules and regulations. I'm not asking for any handouts or subsidies. I will, at my expense, put into your standards all the required roads and streets and curb and sidewalk. I'll put in the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters. I'll pay for all that. The only thing that I'm asking as a developer is that when I finish making this investment in your community, that you, the city, the public, that you agree to take on the long-term responsibility to service and maintain this stuff. What would we say? We'd say, fantastic, right? Right? We jump up and down. Like, you mean we have to spend nothing? You pay for everything? All we got to do is take care of it? This is an excellent deal. We love this. But let's say, we're very smart people. We've heard of this strong town stuff. We want to be prudent. So when the money from this new development comes in, we take the portion that would normally go towards fixing and maintaining stuff around the community, and we just set that aside. And every year when that money comes in, we set it aside and we allow it to accumulate till we get out a generation and have to make good on that promise we're making when we do the development. We make good on it by going out and fixing and taking care of the stuff that we have promised we will do. Here's what that looks like from a cash flow standpoint. In year one, everything is brand new. It hasn't cost you anything. The money comes in, and you take that portion and you set it aside. In year two, more money comes in. You add to what you had in year one. In year three, you add a little more. Year 4 and 5, and you can see on and on and on. A 5-year-old road isn't costing you anything. A 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing you anything, right? A 15-year-old pipe isn't costing you anything. And so you get out a couple of decades and you've just had money coming in, nothing going out. You're feeling very, very rich. You've got a big, huge pot of money there. The problem comes, in this example in year 25, when you have to make good on that promise you made way back at the start. What you find is that the cumulative amount of money you brought in is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, you run far, far into the negative. Now, cities aren't one development, right? Cities are a collection of developments, a series of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes back in a couple years later, says, I've got a project worked really well for you, it worked really well for me. I've got a similar size project I'd like to do over here. And every other year from this point forward, a developer walks in the door with a similar size project. In other words, what I'm modeling here is the ideal scenario for a city. Nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day when we have to make good on all these promises we're accumulating as we grow and develop. Here's what that looks like. In year one, you've got your first development come online. It pays for the entire 25 years shown here. In year 3, you've got a second one that starts to pay in. Year 5, year 7, and on and on and on. And you can see, not only do we have all this money coming in with no money going out, but we're having growth upon growth upon growth. Our cash starts to accelerate upwards. We're feeling very, very rich. And when we get to year 25, year we have to make good on that very first promise we made way back in year 1, yeah, we got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? We've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money over the long term on every project that you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is the answer to that question, why are cities struggling? Why, despite all the growth, despite all the job creation, despite all the programs to make investments, why do we struggle to do basic things? It's because we live way out here now in this new experiment. We live way out here. I want to ask you a couple questions. First, do you recognize yourself in this graph here? Do you recognize your own behavior? It's very easy for us, I think, particularly today in what is a very kind of partisan, polarizing kind of national dialogue, to look at the problems around us and find others to blame. I want you to stop and take a step back and say, do you recognize your own behavior? Psychologists have a term for this. It's called temporal discounting. We as humans are wired to highly value positive feedback today and to deeply discount potential negative feedback in the future. This is why people smoke. This is why you'll go home tonight and instead of going for a walk, you'll sit in front of the TV and have a bowl of ice cream and watch the ball game, right? Like, oh, this ice cream's good. Oh, I like this ball game. Uh-oh, heart disease, right? This is how we're all wired. It's fascinating to me, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to preface it with this. If you know in your heart that you are a hyper-partisan person, I'm going to ask you for the next 60 seconds to dial that from 10 down to 1. Just suppress it as much as you can, because what I'm going to say is not a partisan thing. I don't want you to hear it that way. When I look back at our last presidential election, what I heard as a strong towns advocate were two 70-year-old candidates explaining to me how they were going to bring us back to the best time that they had experienced. Whether that best time was blue-collar jobs and intact families, or whether it was an expansive government able to do big things like Medicare and Social Security expansions. Those things came at a very distinct period of time in American history. What was that? It was right here. It was right here. Tom Friedman, a fellow Minnesotan, now a columnist with the New York Times, wrote a book called That Used to Be Us. And it kind of lamented all the things that we used to do that we no longer do. And one of them, and you hear this over and over again, so we used to invest in infrastructure. We used to build great things. We used to build dams and bridges and all this wonderful stuff. What happened? Yeah, we did. And we spend even more money on it today by large amounts. And we can't keep up with the maintenance. So we see ourselves in this chart. Let me ask one more question, and then we'll move on. What happened to society thousands of years ago that oriented their economy, their local way of living, around this kind of growth strategy? What happened to them? In that period of trial and error experimentation, where people in communities were trying different ways of building, different ways of living, different ways of arranging things, what happened to the ones who oriented their society around this human flaw? They went away. They don't exist anymore. Their ideas were not copied and transmitted to the next generation. It's important for us to grasp how far out on a limb we are. How we have done something that to us every day seems so normal, yet in the context of human history is so radical and so revolutionary. But we don't appreciate how crazy it actually is. Obviously, there's some huge implications to this. The way we become accustomed to growing is actually making us poor, right? They're actually waning. The idea that we can just create more growth, and by creating more growth, solve all these existential problems, it's not working. It's not working. Local governments are going to be forced to absorb the costs of their own development pattern. If we want that road fixed, we have to pay for it. If we want that pipe repaired, that money is going to have to come from us. This can't be done in the current pattern of development without some incredibly large tax increases and or some devastatingly large cuts in services. And by cuts in services, I don't mean a 10% trim of the police budget or put off this maintenance. I mean, this road goes bad, it will never be fixed. This pipe goes out, we will never replace it. This pump goes bad, this whole part of town will no longer get service. Now, this is a conversation every city's having, right? How much do we increase taxes? Where do we cut? It is really, really critical, and this is what we're going to spend the rest of the conversation looking at. It is really critical that we see the third variable in this final conclusion, our current pattern of development. So long as we continue to build in a way that is functionally insolvent, there's no way that our cities will avoid insolvency. As long as we continue to use a development pattern that gives us this comfortable illusion of wealth today in exchange for these enormous long-term liabilities, there's no way that our cities will avoid default. Whether that's a hard default, like we see in places like Stockton and Detroit and San Bernardino, or whether it's a soft default, like we see in thousands of cities across this country, where they're putting off critical maintenance, where they're not taking care of their parks, where they're laying off police and firefighters, where they're closing the libraries early, where they're defaulting on the promises that we've made to each other because we simply don't have the money. We have to have a revolution in our conversation and our thinking to talk about how we build places that are financially productive. So how do we do this? I'm going to disappoint you right off the bat. One of the things early on when I started to go around the country and talk to people in this way, people would stand up at the end and they'd get really mad at me. They would say, Chuck, you came here, you scared the heck out of us, but you didn't give us the solution. What's the solution to these problems? And it took me a while to fully interpret and ingest what they were saying. Because we're going to talk about now how we think about things differently, how we act differently, how we go about things differently. But that's different than a solution. It's really important to understand problems have solutions. Predicaments have outcomes. We don't have a problem. We have created a predicament for ourselves. We are actually going to be managing the outcomes of that predicament. And that's going to mean that things are going to look a lot different. I think we have to stop thinking of solutions because solutions assume that everything can continue the way it has if we just make some tweak somewhere else. Sometimes in common vernacular, we call that kicking the can down the road, right? We're at the point where we now are going to start dealing with the outcomes of this predicament. It's very important for us to mentally make that transition because it changes the way you look at this set of challenges that we have. And I want to start looking at this set of challenges differently by going back to this photo here. This is my hometown back in the early 1900s. And when I saw this photo for the first time, I couldn't believe it was my place. Like, this is amazing. Look at what these people built. The planner in me just loves, the way the buildings line up perfectly, the way they frame the public realm at just the right ratios. There's great segmentation of the space. The buildings have great symmetry. They front the public realm in just this beautiful way. This is an exquisitely designed street. Let me ask you some questions about these people. How thick was their zoning code? How about their comprehensive plan? How many boards and committees do they have to go to get an approval to build something? How much tax subsidy do they give out? How much federal grants and state grants do they get to build infrastructure? How much infrastructure do they build to attract this? How many engineers and planners and economic development advisors do they have on staff? You can go through the litany of things that we have convinced ourselves are absolutely essential to building a great place. They had none of them, none. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. These were a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. Look at what they built. How did they do this? It's really simple. They just copied what they knew worked. They took the materials they had on hand and they built in a style and a pattern that they had seen work for thousands and thousands of years around the world. After 2.5 generations of all the new things we've done to create growth and development, all the professional advice from planners and engineers and others who know how to make cities successful, after all the tax incentives and the tax structures and all the investments we've made in capital improvements, here's what this exact same street looks like today. It's a wasteland of parking lots and half-occupied buildings. And if you want to grasp in one photo why our cities struggle today, understand there's $500,000 of public infrastructure in that little stretch of street right there. Where is the wealth that is going to pay to take care of that generation after generation after generation? I was giving a talk at a university in Boise, Idaho, and I got to this slide, and a student raised their hand, stood up, said, Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way. When we build, we have to build one block at a time. And before we can build the next block, we have to make sure that every gap in the block we just built is filled in. Otherwise, we won't be able to afford it. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way. We're a very poor country now, too. And we can't afford to build this way either. And for a long period of time, that illusion of wealth made us think that this kind of thing didn't matter, that we didn't have to worry about the gaps, that we could run pipe wherever we wanted, we could run road wherever we wanted. We didn't have to worry about what came next. We didn't have to be obsessive about how to make great use of space, fill things in, make things work at a micro level. That was someone else's deal. The places that are going to be successful in the next generation are going to be the ones that obsess about that kind of thing. Obsess about the micro details. Obsess about the tiny use of space. Obsess about the productivity of the things we build. So we need to shift our thinking to become obsessive about different things. How do we do this? How do we make this transition in thinking? The first thing we have to do is get rid of our worst habits. Build it and they will come is a fantastic movie plot. It literally has everything, right? Baseball, Iowa, cornfields. Like, what else do you want in a movie, right? It's a great movie. It's a horrible economic development strategy. We are in what we at Strong Towns call the desperation phase of this suburban experiment. We are so desperate for growth that we are willing to do almost anything to experience it. Most of our cities have teams of people ready to hand up tax subsidies to whoever comes through town. We're always chasing after the federal grants and the loans to build new infrastructure, to create new space for new development, to lower the bar of entry. This is not how cities build wealth. And this is not how cities have ever built wealth. I'm going to show you right now the very simple way that cities build wealth. Do any of you recognize this city here? And if you were at the presentation last night, don't blurt this out. Do any of you, is this city, do any of you recognize this place? Look closely. If I said this was Conway, would that shock you? If I said Little Rock? It shouldn't, because they both looked just like this at some point in the past. If I said St. Louis, could have been. Definitely a little bit further north, though, right, with the trees. Minneapolis, maybe. Maybe Detroit. If we look at cities across the world, what we see is that every city that was ever built prior to our new experimental way to build, every city that was ever built started just like this. Chicago started like this, San Francisco, Vancouver, Los Angeles started like this, Phoenix, Dallas, Manhattan started just like this. London, Paris, Rome. You could have a picture of Romulus and Remus standing out in front of Rome like this, right? They all started like this. Little pop-ups, shacks, some hopes and some dreams. We built thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. All those complex variables just didn't come together in the right way. What happened when a place like this failed? Did unemployment skyrocket? Did the stock market crash? Did we have to have an emergency bailout of Wall Street banks? No. What happened? Yeah, well, a few people lost a little bit of money. They salvaged what they could and they moved on, right? These are little bets. They're little investments. It's money we can afford to lose in the macro sense. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact. A lot of these places were successful. All those complex variables came together to form a place that started to grow. And when it would grow in a very simple to understand way. It would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. And so after 30 years of growing incrementally, this little street, which is my hometown in 1870, would become this one I showed you earlier. And after another 40 years of incrementally growing up, incrementally growing out, and incrementally becoming more intense, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would be turned into buildings of brick and granite. We don't build wealth by going to the casino and putting it all on red. The way we build wealth in a community is by making modest investments over a broad area over a long period of time. Let me show you how financially productive this style of development is. These are 2 blocks in my hometown. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. If you look at them, you'll see they're the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure. The only thing different about them is the style of development. In the 1920s, this is what the old and blighted block looks like today. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks. What you are looking at here is the 1920s equivalent of that pop-up shack building I showed you. This would have been the thing out on the far edge of town that someone built in the hopes that someday enough growth would happen where they could add a second and a third story and have it be more intense. Of course, that's not what happened, right? These were built, and then afterward came the Great Depression, World War II, and then a completely new style of development that just skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These places have stagnated for nearly 100 years now. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. The city labeled it blight and had it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's drive-thru. Everybody was thrilled about this, right? We got rid of blight. We've got something shiny and new. The new thing met all the zoning codes, met all the parking requirements, met all the sign ordinances. The engineer was happy because we got rid of that nasty on-street parking. Now the traffic flows more smoothly. The bike walk people were happy because they got a sidewalk put in. The sidewalk ends right there, but they got that stretch put in. The environmental people were happy because they got them to put in a little bit of green space and some native plants in the stormwater area. So this checked every box, every public policy box that we had. That old and blighted block, when this was done, was worth $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, just a different style of development. When this was built, it was only worth $800,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, the way we built cities incrementally for thousands and thousands of years. You're looking at that in its infant phase after nearly a century of neglect and decline. And it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. And we all know what's going to happen to that Taco John's, right? 15 years from now, 20 years from now, it'll be a used car lot. 5 years later, it will be boarded up. There'll be a new taco place up the road, right? We'll be trying to get a grant or a tax subsidy to get it torn down and redeveloped. We've all been around long enough to see this. In fact, in the years since this was built, here's what's actually happened to the tax value. That old and blighted block now pays 78% more taxes to the city than that shiny and new one. This is the kind of thing that we see all over within our cities. Out on the edge, it's a very similar story. This is our Mills Fleet Farm complex. Do you all have Mills Fleet Farm here in Arkansas? Please tell me yes. No? You are missing out. I think you would like Mills Fleet Farm. I've been here now to Arkansas a few times. I think culturally we share similar values in this way. Here's what you get in a Mills Fleet Farm. When you walk in, auto parts, animal feed, lumber, guns and ammo, camouflage lingerie. That's the product mix. It's wildly successful in Minnesota. I think that we should try to get you a franchise down here. This is the biggest one. We're the home of Mills Fleet Farm. We're where all the magic started. So we have the biggest one in the world. That little orange thing there is a big silo out front. It's a cultural experience, I'm telling you. If you ever see one, you got to try it. This is a 20-acre piece of property, auto dealership, gas station. This is the most valuable piece of property in the whole area. When these people show up at a meeting, we just stop the meeting and ask them, what do you need, right? Here's 20 acres of our core downtown. If you've seen the movie Fargo, you've seen a not so flattering, but not so inaccurate portrayal of downtown Brainerd. We're working at it, it's getting better. But as you can see, we've converted a lot of our space into parking. There's not been anything new built down there in my lifetime. A lot of things that have been torn down or burned down to make way for more parking. Most of our second and third stories are unoccupied. Our first stories are struggle to keep tenants, but we're like I said, we're doing a little bit better in the last couple years. When we look out on the edge to that 20 acres, what we see is that it has a huge amount of value. $600,000 an acre. It's a big sum of money, particularly in one taxpayer, right? But when we go to the 20 acres downtown, the same size area, just a different style of development, a different way of assembling a place, what we see is it has a value that's 78% greater. Despite the decline, despite the neglect. How much did it cost us to get that development at a Mills Fleet Farm? Well, we spent a couple $100 million on the bypass. We spent tens of millions running sewer and water out to here. We spent millions more building frontage roads and backage roads. How much did that development in the downtown cost my generation? Nothing. That was wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their peers built slowly and incrementally over time and bequeathed to us as a repository of wealth that we could draw on in good times and in bad times for generations. And we've slowly milked it down, but look at how much value is still there. What happens when Mills Fleet Farm goes out of business? At some point it will, whether it's 5 years from now or 50 years from now. At some point that will not be the highest and best use. We've seen this in our communities when these stores close. What happens? What comes next? I don't know. But what we can confidently say is that whatever comes next is going to be lower on the economic food chain than what is there now. This is the peak. In that 20 acres downtown, there's 134 different properties. What happens when one of them loses a tenant? Or someone goes out of business? Or in our wisdom, we discover that we have too much retail space, not enough office space. Or too much office space, not enough residential space. Well, these buildings are very adaptable. They're highly flexible. They can become many, many different things. I've seen in my lifetime the buildings become many different things. These buildings are designed to adapt and change with us over time. There's a reason our ancestors, and I use that in the broadest possible sense of the term, our ancestors around the world for thousands and thousands of years built in this way. Not only is it financially really, really productive and successful, but it's highly adaptable, highly flexible. It will evolve and change with us. I'm going to show you now, because I've looked at a couple sites, I'm going to show you that this is part of a larger trend in how we assemble our cities. What I'm going to go through now is some work that's been done by Joe Minicozy, a good friend of mine, and his team at Urban 3 out of Asheville. What they have done is they've gone out and said, where is the most productive parts of a city? And they've modeled thousands of cities asking this question. What I'm going to show you right now in the third dimension is value per acre. If you think of a farmer going out and planting seed across a field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of this field. Well, where's the most productive part of the city? Where are you getting the most value per acre? This is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York has lost population every census since World War II. It's been a continual downward trajectory. If you're willing to move to Buffalo, New York today, they will sell you a house for $1 if you're willing to stay there for 5 years and fix it up. That's poor. If you go to downtown Buffalo, you'll see it's a place that's been hollowed out. It's suffered decades and decades of disinvestment. Yet when we step back and we say, where in Buffalo, New York is the wealth? Can you point to the traditional downtown? and its surrounding neighborhoods. Not only is this place a repository of wealth, despite the decline, despite the neglect, but it absolutely outperforms everything else by a huge margin. We see this in cities of all sizes. Here's a mid-sized city in upstate New York, the same kind of thing. Here's a little town by where I live, about 1,000 people. When I first went to this place, they said, Chuck, we've got some great stuff going on here. We've got some great stuff going on here. These neighborhoods here are terrible. We've got to get some way to get this stuff torn down and replaced. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. In those poor neighborhoods. In the neighborhoods where all the poor people live. When we step back and look at the building types, what we see is a path for how we can start to adapt this landscape we've created into something financially productive. These are from North Carolina, but they could be from Arkansas. They could be from anywhere because we've modeled this around the country. The numbers are very similar. Here's a Kmart, $384,000 an acre. Here's a Walmart, $967,000 an acre. When we go to the downtown, here's an old warehouse that's been converted into a supper club now, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all time, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. Here's a question we need to ask ourselves. When we step back and we look at our cities, when we experience the places that we've built at 2 miles an hour instead of 40 miles an hour, when we actually walk them instead of drive them, what we find very quickly is that our cities are oppressively filled with gaps. It's overwhelming and oppressive. If you start to become aware of this, it is going to bother you continuously. The world for me is like fingers on a chalkboard. I look at cities and it makes me sick to my stomach because they are nothing but huge gaps. Huge, huge gaps. The most absurd statement that we culturally say all the time is that this neighborhood is built out. This city is built out. This thing is built out. How many of you have ever uttered those words? We need more land because we're built out. It is utterly insane. And no generation in all of human history has ever uttered those words until the current one. And the only reason we do is because we are so disconnected from what's actually going on. Go out and walk it. You will be overwhelmed with the amount of gaps. When we start to think about that space, how we make productive use of it, how we start to build in the adaptability and the resilience, how we start to build in the financial productivity, how we start to obsess about our use of the is, do we have the sophistication? Do we have the level of competence? Do we have the capability and the capacity to build something as refined as Jimmy's Pizza? Because if we can reach that bar, look at what we can do. Look at the amount of wealth we can create. That's a pretty low bar, friends. We can do that. We can do that right now. If you're a big city, if you're a small town, you can do that today. That's not beyond the grasp of anyone, and that's kind of the point. The way we build wealth is by making modest investments over a broad area, over a long period of time. This is the first step that all of human history experienced. And because I've got a couple extra minutes here, I've gotten to this point faster than I planned. Let me point out one thing to you. Not to be gratuitous about this, but I think when we're talking about the strength and resilience of our communities, it's really hard to get someone. It's really hard to get someone to go to the local hardware store and pay $20 for a hammer when you can go to the Home Depot or the whatever and get it for $12. That's an economic decision, and I get that, and I honor the people who will pay the extra $8, but you're not, like, as economists would say, you're not rational actors, right? You're motivated by something else, and that's honorable, but I don't think the vast majority of people act that way. But when we can go buy a pizza at Jimmy's Pizza, where do those profits go? Yeah, Jimmy. When we go here and buy our pizza, where do those profits go?
Northwest Arkansas.
Right. It's a funny one. It's funny, I know where you're going, but it's... You could go speak with the good people in Northwest Arkansas, and they get this too. That's why they're doing different things. Yes. They also understand that their business model is going away and changing dramatically. Who is Jimmy?
He's dad.
Jimmy's a dad. He's a husband. Maybe he volunteers in the community. He's on the Rotary, right? His kids go to school with your kids. He goes to church with you. Jimmy has a float in your 4th of July parade. He sponsors a softball team. Look at the depth of community that comes from Jimmy. When I talk about this experiment and how we built places in a certain way, and we focus on the finances, and we focus on the development pattern, what we sometimes overlook is all those connections underneath that used to be a part of how we resolve conflict, how we got to know the other, how we made decisions in a community. And when we step back and look at the dysfunction we're having now, just talking to each other, it's hard not to draw connections, right? Jimmy's Pizza, this style of development is not only a revolution for us in how we build financial productivity back in a place, it may also be a revolution for us in how we create places again, places for people. I want to end with this story here because it ties into the idea of small investments being the catalyst we need. This is a little block in Memphis, Tennessee. I've been able to do a lot of things with Memphis, Tennessee, and it's one of my favorite places. Not because they are wealthy, they're very much not. Not because they're successful, I think by most measurements they are not. But it's one of my favorite places because of the spirit of the people there, their ingenuity, their willingness to step up and do things. A lot of places spend a lot of effort trying to build social capital. Is that like a thing we talk about? In Memphis, it runs like a river. It's an exciting place. Here's a little street, used to be a streetcar stop. In the 1950s, in our experiment on how we were going to build prosperity and growth and success for people, we decided that we were going to rip out all the streetcar lines, run a highway through the middle of this neighborhood, rip out part of it and relocate the people that were there and build something that would be better. The end result was that this streetcar stop block just died, and this neighborhood went into terminal decline because it was designed around a certain set of structures that we ripped out. Some neighbors today, fed up with the decline, fed up with the neglect, took matters into their own hands. They went out, they worked with the shop owners to get them swept up. They swept up the sidewalks. They went out and painted some bike lanes. They painted their own crosswalks. They put up a mural. They put out some benches and some planters. For one weekend, they invited businesses from around the city to come in and open up here. They had a couple art galleries, a bike shop, an ice cream stand. They didn't go get city permission. They didn't go get Department of Health inspections. They figured that by the time anybody got mad and came out to shut them down, they'd be long gone anyway. Let's just show people what could happen if someone, gave a damn out here. I wasn't here for this project. But they brought me out here 6 months later to show me what had happened. 6 months later, every single one of these vacant storefronts was now occupied. I talked to one of the landlords that owned the building. He said he's able to charge double the amount of rent for the last building to go than what they were asking for the first one. The city's documented 18 new businesses, 32 new jobs, $12 million of property value appreciation. Total public investment, 0. We are so enamored with the big project. We're so taken with the idea that we can do one big transformative thing and all these other things will happen, that we run from big project to big project to big project without ever taking care of those details of making things happen. And they've not happened. They've never happened. They don't happen. It's in the details where we make our cities productive. It's in the details where we make our cities successful. It's so much easier for us to work at this level. It's so much less comfortable. I was going to say harder. It's not harder. It's less comfortable to work at this level. But that's the level we need to get out and work at. In my hometown, after I put out the little thing about the Taco Johns and kind of embarrassed people, and they were embarrassed. They were not happy with me. They came back to me and said, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, what would you have done different? And it took me a while to figure that one out because they wanted to know, would you have said no to Taco John's, Chuck? They're here. Would you have denied them a permit? And it took me a while to unwrap the question because what it really assumed was that this decline is normal. The decline of this neighborhood is inevitable. It's a natural part of things. And if you look at our current development experiment, decline is normal. It's baked into it. We build something. When it goes into decline, we move on and build the next one. Then we move on and build the next one. And we leave in our wake places that are designed to fail. I think we need to question that whole system. What we came up with is a little thing we called Neighborhoods First. The idea of going out and saying we're not going to abandon this neighborhood. We're going to go out and observe where people struggle. And we are going to make incremental investments to address those struggles day after day, week after week. I went to the city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. Yeah, do you know what he said? Why would you say that, Chuck? We're so obsessed with getting the dollar and the big project. We have overlooked the pennies, nickels, and the dimes, just waiting there, laying there for us to pick up. If we can retune our senses, if we can see value in the small and incremental, if we can start to be obsessed with those gaps, and feel oppressed by them because it's our wealth, our community's wealth, flowing away. If we could do these things, we can start to focus on the things that will make our communities stronger, the things that will make our communities financially more successful, and in the process, we cannot help but make our places better places to live for the people who are there today. Thank you so much for having me. Just very, very briefly, I always get people ask me, can I get a copy of your slides? If you go to strongtowns.org/chat, they'll ask for your email address and they'll email them right to you. My staff is amazing. They figured this out. I also get asked, Chuck, what should I do? We have two things that we ask people to do. If you are inspired by this message, we are trying to build a national movement of people talking about this differently. And if you want to help us, the number one thing you can do is to talk to somebody about this. If you are inspired by this, if you care about this, if you think this is an important thing, go have a conversation with someone not in this room, someone who doesn't know about this, and talk to them about it in your words, in your way. If you go to our website, we've got tons of ways to help you do this. If you care about biking, if you care about walking, if you care about economics, we've got all this stuff for you to use to have conversations with people around you. If you are really, really inspired by us, you can sign up to become a member of Strong Towns. We support our organization by thousands of people around the country making small donations. We do the same way as we're asking cities to do, and it helps us to do things like this and reach more people. So thank you so very much. Time for...
We do not have a whole lot of time, but we have time for a couple questions if there's anyone who has a question. Now, we had quite a few last night. So.
Yeah. No questions. Everybody.
Not-
Go ahead.
In these towns where you've got this blight, one of the things that we find in some of our communities is the landowner thinks that they have a real value in this, and so they will set a value that's unattainable by a developer. So, have you come across anyone that has a strategy to overcome that? As an economist, I have some ideas, but.
Well, I think that there's, we could do 2 hours on that topic. You and I probably could together. It's hard to, Federal Reserve sponsoring of this event aside, it's really hard to understand what's going on with the underlying land value and housing market today. I think there's a lot of theories and a lot of people talking about it. I think a couple things are very clear. Number one, cities benefit from having property values artificially elevated. Number two, current property owners benefit from having properties artificially elevated. Number three, the overall macroeconomy benefits, and all these are in the short term, mind you, by having property values artificially elevated. So when people say, like, well, property values aren't artificially elevated, I'm like, every incentive of everybody who has a say in this system is to artificially elevate property values. I feel like we have a massive structural bubble in housing, and you see this when people go out and try to do what I think in the past would have been very common sense things. I'm gonna not to waylay that conversation too much, but I'm gonna point out one thing to you, because you can walk away from this presentation nostalgizing the America of the 1920s and 30s and the development pattern. I don't want you to do that. There's some very real reasons why people walked away from it and tried something new, and there were reasons for reform. One of the main ones was that when you build from a spot incrementally out, what you're doing is you're using the value of the place and translate that into the value of the underlying land to drive redevelopment. If you look at land values in Manhattan, they're a lot different than land values in downtown Conway. Why? Because the stuff around there is worth so much more. And because the land value is more, what you build on it is more, right? Our cities used to build wealth in the land, and that high land value is what kept and drove redevelopment. So things didn't go into decline, or if they went into decline, that became an opportunity for investment. What the automobile did, and what our obsession with the automobile did, is it ended the tyranny, and you can think of this as Daddy Warbucks, like owning all the land in the downtown. If you were new coming to town, where did you have to build? Out on the edge, in that little pop-up block. That was you. And what you were hoping is that over time, the city would continue to grow and that would become more valuable. What we did when we built highways through the middle of the city is we just increased the supply of developable land. And when you increase the supply of developable land, supply and demand dynamic says what? Even if demand stays the same, the price does what? It goes way down. And so what we did is we killed downtown land values. We killed values in core neighborhoods. What we're starting to see now is like a weird, random dynamic. And it's bizarre because if you map out land values across a city, what you see is that they're really not correlated with anything. They're very random. And I sense that, 100 years ago, it would have been random too, because like I inherited this property from whatever, and I'm not going to sell at any price. You always have those players in the market that are irrational, and I think that, that's just life. But over the broad sense, our underlying land and housing values have become very irrational, and I think disconnected from people's incomes, people's ability to pay, all these other factors that historically have been part of it. So I don't even know how to answer the question really, except to say it's very crazy and it feels like it can't continue But I said that in 2008, and we're here, and it has continued. So I don't know.
But really about the conversation and making people aware and maybe having people start thinking in a more rational sense
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of what I obsess about is how fragile our cities are and how fragile our communities are and our places are. One of the biggest fragilities that we have at the local level is this, I think, crazy, distorted housing market. We all saw in 2008, I mean, I'm looking around the room, everybody here is old enough to have experienced that in some way. We saw the abject panic of huge swaths of the country when all of a sudden, you know, a huge percentage of people had houses that were underwater, people who had been planning with home equity to buy things or to sell their home for their retirement plan, all of a sudden looked and said, all these plans I've made are not working. We have created a system that, you know, an ownership society, well, the downship of an ownership society is that if everybody puts their wealth into the same asset class, you better make damn sure that that asset class, nothing ever happens to it. To me, it feels very, very shaky because all of our wealth and prosperity is based on the housing market. And I'm not convinced that it's stable long term. Because really, when you go through the stuff that I just showed you about, you know, where we've developed and what the long-term just maintenance costs are, it's not a long-term viable prospect. What happens? We are out of time. I am at strongtowns.org. You can get plugged into our conversation. I'm on Facebook and Slack. You can get connected to us on there. And we love this conversation, and I would have it all day if I could. But get connected to us, and we'll continue this. So thank you so much. Thank you.